The copper taste of adrenaline flooded the back of her throat, thick and warm. Below the concrete courtyard was a meat grinder. The radio at her collar spat static, and the panicked screams of the men who just 3 hours ago had smirked at her in the briefing room. They were dying down there. Cameron didn't smile. She didn't feel vindicated. She just felt the heavy, familiar drag of the rifle's trigger against her index finger. Exhale, squeeze. The briefing room in the makeshift FOB smelled like floor-wax stale coffee and unwashed Kevlar. It was a sour, masculine funk that Cameron Hayes had breathed in for so long, she only noticed it when she returned from leave. Lieutenant Commander Stanton stood at the front of the room, a laser pointer dancing erratically over a satellite map of an abandoned phosphate plant in the Syrian basin. Stanton was a man built out of right angles and unearned confidence. He spoke with the slow, deliberate cadence of someone who assumed his audience was slightly deaf or entirely stupid. "The insertion point is here," Stanton said, tapping a red dot on the screen. Ground assault element moves through the Wadi breaches the primary structure. Sniper overwatch will position at elevation 09er. You'll have a 600-yard line of sight on the southern egress. Stanton finally dragged his eyes away from the screen and let them settle on Cameron. The silence in the room shifted. It wasn't the dead quiet of respect. It was the suffocating, heavy silence of 30 men holding their breath, waiting for the punchline. "You good with that, Hayes?" Stanton asked. He didn't call her commander. He rarely did. "It's a steep hump up that ridge. If the rifle gets too heavy, O'Connor can carry it for you." A low collective chuckle rippled through the rows of folding chairs. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a movie villain's laugh. It was worse. It was casual. It was the sound of men who fundamentally believed she was a PR stunt in a multicam uniform. Cameron didn't flush. She didn't bite her lip or clench her fists in righteous fury. She was 34 years old, and she was so goddamn tired of this specific, quiet brand of exhaustion. Her knees ached from a decade of forced rucks, her lower back felt like it was strung with piano wire, and the coffee in her stomach was turning acidic. She didn't want to prove a point. She just wanted to do the math, find the windage, and go to sleep. The TAC 338 weighs 22 pounds, Stanton. Cameron said her voice entirely flat. She kept her eyes on the map, refusing to give him the satisfaction of eye contact. "I can manage it, but if the assault element takes the Wadi, you're funneling yourself into a defilade. If they have a DSHK heavy machine gun on the roof of the sorting facility, they will chew you to pieces before you clear the first wall." Stanton's jaw tightened. The easy amusement vanished, replaced by the brittle defense mechanism of a threatened ego. "Intel says the sorting facility is clear. We rely on the intel Hayes, not ghost stories. Your job is to sit on the hill and let us know if anyone tries to run." Beside her, O'Connor, her spotter a kid from Southie, who chewed his fingernails down to the quick shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He bumped his knee against hers under the table. A silent "let it go." "Copy that," Cameron murmured. She reached into her chest pocket, pulled out a battered notebook, and jotted down a string of numbers. Wind speed, barometric pressure. She could feel their eyes on her. The female seal, the anomaly, the congressional experiment. They thought she was obsessed with being a hero. They didn't understand that she was actually terrified of making a mistake, not because it would cost her her life, but because if she failed, it would be the only thing they ever remembered about her. As the briefing broke up, the men filed out shoulders, bumping, laughing about something Tate had said. Cameron stayed in her chair for a long moment, listening to the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. The lights flickered a dying, erratic pulse. She ran her thumb over the rough knurling of her pen. Let them laugh, she thought, rubbing the bridge of her nose. The bullet doesn't care who pulls the trigger. The helicopter ride was a sensory deprivation chamber of noise and vibration. The CH-47 Chinook rattled so hard, Cameron could feel her molars grinding together. The cabin was bathed in the sickly green glow of night vision. The men of the assault element sat across from her, a row of identical faceless helmets and plate carriers. Nobody looked at her. When the ramp dropped, the heat hit them like a physical blow. Even at 0200, the desert held onto the day's violence, radiating a dry, suffocating warmth. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with the ancient, powdery scent of crushed limestone. 5 miles, O'Connor whispered over the internal comms as they broke away from the main element. Pace is ours. Let's move, Cameron said. The hike to the overwatch position was brutal. The terrain was loose shale and jagged rock that tore at the rubber soles of their boots. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. Cameron carried 60 pounds of gear, the sniper rifle, the spotting scope ammunition water radio, and the heavy ghillie suit strapped to her pack. Her shoulders burned a deep lactic acid fire that spread down her triceps. She focused on the rhythm of her breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth, a metronome of suffering. They reached the ridge 2 hours before dawn. The hide was a collapsed concrete drainage pipe overlooking the phosphate plant. It was tight, claustrophobic, and reeked of feral dog urine. "Home, sweet home," O'Connor muttered, sliding into the dirt on his stomach. Cameron crawled in beside him. The concrete scraped the skin off her left elbow, but she barely registered the sting. She unclipped the TAC 338 from her pack, moving with slow, deliberate precision. In the dark, her hands knew every curve and contour of the weapon. She extended the bipod, seated the stock firmly against her shoulder, and looked through the glass. The plant was a skeleton of industry. Rusted silos, conveyor belts drooping like broken spines, and the massive blocky shape of the sorting facility Stanton had dismissed. They set up the camouflage netting, tying it off with paracord, so it blended seamlessly with the scrub and rock. Then the waiting began. This was the part the movies never showed. The agonizing, mind-numbing boredom. As the sun crested the horizon, the temperature inside the pipe skyrocketed. Sweat pooled in the small of Cameron's back and ran in stinging rivulets down her forehead, settling in the corners of her eyes. She couldn't wipe them. Movement meant compromise. Flies, aggressive and thick, buzzed around her face, landing on her lips and crawling over the lenses of her scope. She breathed through her teeth to keep them out of her mouth. The smell of her own unwashed body, a sharp, oniony tang of stress sweat, filled the small space. "Range to the primary breach point," she whispered, her voice gravelly from dehydration. 580 yards. O'Connor replied softly, his eye pressed to the spotting scope. "Wind is 3 knots coming out of the southeast. Mirage is starting to pick up off the concrete." Cameron adjusted the elevation dial on her scope. Click, click, click. The sound was crisp, reassuring. It was the only thing in this chaotic world she had absolute control over. Down below, the radio cracked to life. Stanton's voice artificially calm. "Overwatch, this is Assault 1. We are moving into the wadi, approaching the breach. Copy, Assault 1. Cameron keyed her mic. Eyes on. She tracked them through the scope. Small green shapes moving like ants through the deep, dry riverbed. Stanton was leading them right into the choke point, just as he had planned. Just as she had warned him not to, Cameron shifted her crosshairs up to the roof of the sorting facility. The heat waves, the mirage, made the concrete edges shimmer and dance like water. She stared until her eyes watered, looking for the absence of normal. A shadow that shouldn't be there. A shape that didn't fit the geometry of the roof. Nothing, just baking stone and rust. "You think they're home?" O'Connor asked, his voice barely a breath. "They're home," Cameron said, a cold knot forming in her stomach. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy. It was a drawn bowstring. Keep your eyes on the second-story windows of the main silo. She settled her breathing, heart rate dropping, 60 beats per minute, 55. She became a machine, an extension of the glass and steel. The burning in her muscles faded. The flies disappeared. There was only the reticle and the dust, and the slow, inevitable ticking of the clock. Breach in 30 seconds. Stanton's voice clicked over the net. He sounded winded, his bravado slightly muffled by the exertion of the hike. Cameron watched through the scope as the assault element stacked up against the crumbling outer wall of the phosphate plant. The wadi had funneled them perfectly into a tight, clustered formation. If a grenade dropped in there now, it would be a massacre. O'Connor. Cameron murmured, her lips barely moving. Scan the southern ridge. Give me a wider picture. Scanning. Clear. It's quiet, boss. Too quiet. Cameron's index finger rested flat against the trigger guard. She felt a phantom itch at the base of her skull. It was an instinct built over a dozen deployments, a subconscious processing of micro-details her active brain hadn't caught yet. A flock of birds hadn't returned to the silos. The dust in the courtyard wasn't swirling naturally. Something was blocking the wind. Breaching. A muffled thump echoed up the valley, followed by a plume of grey smoke as the entry charge blew the steel doors off their hinges. Assault 1 flooded into the courtyard, and the world ripped open. It didn't start with a single shot. It started with a deafening, continuous roar that saturated the radio net and echoed off the canyon walls. Do-do-do-do-do-do. The unmistakable, heavy, rhythmic pounding of a DSHK 12.7mm machine gun. Contact, contact front. Heavy fire from the sorting facility roof. Tate's voice screamed over the radio, completely abandoning protocol, raw panic bleeding through the static. Cameron snapped her scope to the roof. The shimmer of the heat mirage parted, and there it was. Not a ghost story. A three-man team entrenched behind sandbags that had been perfectly camouflaged with concrete dust, pouring armor-piercing rounds down into the courtyard. We're pinned, taking casualties. Griggs is hit. The radio was a mess of overlapping screams. Cameron didn't blink. The cynical detachment that had protected her in the briefing room vanished, replaced by an ice-cold, terrifying clarity. This was the 5 minutes. This was the window where people lived or died based on the math in her head and the pressure of her finger. Distance to the gun, she snapped. 620 yards. O'Connor yelled no longer, whispering, dialing his spotting scope in. Wind is shifting 5 knots full value from the left. Cameron didn't calculate on paper. Her brain did the geometry automatically. 620 yards, bullet drop, windage, spin drift. She swung the heavy barrel of the TAC 338. The crosshairs settled on the muzzle flash of the heavy machine gun. Through the magnification, she could see the shooter, a man in a dark green plate carrier, his shoulders shaking with the recoil of the weapon. She exhaled. The world went totally silent. She dragged the trigger straight back. The rifle roared, bucking violently against her shoulder. The concussive wave kicked up a cloud of dust inside the concrete pipe, stinging her eyes, but she didn't lose the sight picture. She forced the crosshairs back down instantly, racking the bolt back with her right hand. The spent brass casing ejected, spinning through the air, hot and smoking, hitting O'Connor in the arm. He didn't even flinch. Impact, O'Connor barked. Center mass, gunner is down. Through the scope, the man on the DSHK slumped forward, draped over the weapon. But the second man in the nest was already shoving his body out of the way, grabbing the spade grips of the heavy machine gun. Overwatch. Where the fuck is Overwatch? Stanton was screaming on the radio. He didn't even realize she was already firing. Hold your water, Stanton, Cameron muttered to herself. She racked the bolt forward, chambering the second round. The brass seated with a smooth, deadly snick. The second gunner was trying to depress the barrel to track the SEALs taking cover behind a rusted tractor. Cameron adjusted her point of aim, compensating for the slight shift in the wind that O'Connor had called out. She aimed at the left edge of the man's helmet, expecting the wind to push the heavy point .338 Lapua Magnum round right into the center of his face. Breathe, pause, squeeze. The recoil punched her. She racked the bolt. Splash, O'Connor said. Target 2 down. The third guy is bailing. The third man in the nest, the ammo bearer, had seen his 2 comrades drop in the span of 4 seconds. He abandoned the gun, scrambling backward over the sandbags, trying to reach the roof access door. Cameron tracked him. He was moving fast, a dark blur against the blinding white of the concrete roof. She led him, placing the crosshairs 2 feet in front of his sprinting form. Running target, she breathed. Distance 630. O'Connor supplied his voice a metronome. Keep the wind. She fired. The bullet traveled the distance in less than a second, but through the glass it felt like slow motion. The running man suddenly pitched forward, his legs buckling as the round took him through the spine. He hit the concrete roof and didn't move. 3 rounds, 3 hostiles down, 12 seconds. But the silence in the courtyard only lasted for a heartbeat. Suddenly, the windows of the main silo, the ones Cameron had told O'Connor to watch, exploded outward. A half-dozen muzzles flashed in the shadows. They weren't shooting at the assault element anymore. They had seen the dust kick up from Cameron's hide. They were shooting at the ridge. A burst of automatic fire chewed into the dirt 3 feet in front of the concrete pipe, spraying Cameron and O'Connor with sharp fragments of limestone. A round spalled against the top of the pipe, ringing like a cracked bell, a deafening shriek of metal on concrete. They have us, O'Connor shouted, pressing himself flat into the dirt. Cameron didn't lower her head. The copper taste of adrenaline flooded the back of her throat, thick and warm. The men in the briefing room had laughed at her. They had thought she was fragile. They thought she was a box to be checked. She looked through the glass at the dark, flashing windows of the silo. O'Connor, Cameron said, her voice dropping an octave, dead and hollow. Give me ranges. We're going to clear that building. A bullet traveling at 2,800 feet per second does not whistle. It cracks. It is a sharp, violent sonic boom that physically slaps the eardrums, followed a fraction of a second later by the duller thud of the rifle that fired it. Right now, the air inside the concrete drainage pipe was tearing apart with those cracks. Smack, 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 crack. Limestone dust rained down from the ceiling of the pipe, coating the sweat on Cameron's neck in a gritty, greyish paste. A round skipped off the dirt lip of their hide, kicking a spray of pulverized shale directly into O'Connor's face. He let out a sharp, breathless hiss, throwing a gloved hand over his eyes, his spotting scope momentarily abandoned. I'm blind, I'm blind. O'Connor choked out spitting grit, his voice spiking into a register that belonged to a terrified kid, not a Tier 1 operator. Keep your head down, Cameron ordered. Her voice was unrecognizable to her own ears. It wasn't the calm, authoritative bark of a commander. It was a strained, guttural scrape. She didn't look at him. She couldn't afford to care about his eyes right now. She pressed her cheek welled harder against the adjustable stock of the TC-338, her jaw muscles knotting so intensely her teeth ached. The fear was there, a cold, acidic pool sitting in the bottom of her stomach, heavy and nauseating. But the training drilled into her through thousands of hours of mindless, repetitive misery hijacked her nervous system. She blinked the stinging sweat from her right eye. The crosshairs hovered over the dark, jagged maw of the silo's second-story windows. The contrast was a nightmare. Outside, the Syrian sun was blindingly bright, bleaching the concrete white. Inside the windows, it was pitch black. Flash. A stuttering yellow strobe lit up the shadows in the second window from the left. An AK pattern rifle firing blindly. 590, she whispered to herself. The wind had died in the sudden barrage. Dead hold. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't consciously decide to fire. The sear broke. The heavy rifle slammed into her bruised shoulder, a localized earthquake. Through the glass, she saw the muzzle flash in the window, abruptly snuff out. A body heavy and limp tumbled forward, draped over the rusted windowsill for a second, before sliding backward into the dark. 4 down. She worked the bolt. Her palm slick with sweat, her grip slipped on the oversized handle for a fraction of a second. A mistake. A clumsy, amateur mistake. She swore a harsh syllable lost in the deafening echo of incoming fire and shoved the bolt forward, chambering the next round. Whack, whack, whack. 3 rounds chewed into the concrete edge of the pipe, inches from the barrel of her rifle. The spalling rock sliced a thin, hot line across her left cheek. She felt the blood instantly bead and run down her jaw, warm and ticklish. Window 4. O'Connor gasped. He was back on the glass. His left eye squeezed shut, tears streaming down his face as his body tried to flush the limestone from his cornea. 2 shooters, left side of the frame. Cameron shifted the weapon. The bipod feet dug small trenches in the dirt. She found the 4th window. 2 distinct shapes, darker than the shadows, leaning out to acquire the angle on her pipe. She inhaled the smell of burnt gunpowder, a sharp metallic ammonia that burned her sinuses. Exhale, pause, pull, the recoil, the racking of the bolt. A hot brass casing bounced off the curved wall of the pipe and landed directly on the exposed sliver of skin at the back of her neck. It seared her, a localized branding iron of pain. Cameron convulsed an involuntary shudder, tearing through her spine, but her hands stayed clamped on the rifle. She didn't swat the brass away. She couldn't take her hand off the pistol grip. She let it burn into her skin, gritting her teeth until she tasted copper. Hit, O'Connor reported, his voice shaking. Target 5 down. Second guy is shifting right. Cameron was already there. She tracked the shadow moving behind the rusted, corrugated metal dividing the windows. She didn't wait for him to pop out. The .338 Lapua armor-piercing round didn't care about 30-year-old rusted sheet metal. She aimed at the solid wall, visualizing the trajectory, the speed of his movement. She pulled the trigger. The sheet metal punched outward, a jagged hole appearing exactly where the man's center of mass should be. A mist of dark fluid sprayed the wall behind him, barely visible in the gloom. 6 down. The incoming fire from the silo stopped. The silence crashed back down on them, heavier and more suffocating than before. Cameron lay there, her chest heaving against the dirt, the hot casing finally rolling off her blistered neck and falling into the dust. Her shoulder throbbed with a deep, dull ache. She had fired 6 magnum rounds in less than 90 seconds. The barrel of the TAC 338 was beginning to smoke, the heat radiating back into her face, cooking the air inside the pipe. Down in the courtyard, the screaming started again. Overwatch Assault 1. We are dying down here. Stanton's voice was completely unhinged. It was the sound of a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of control, only to have the universe strip it away in under 3 minutes. The radio static hissed and popped with the background noise of the courtyard, groans, the frantic scuffing of boots on concrete, the tearing of Velcro. Status Assault 1. Cameron said, pressing her thumb against the push-to-talk button on her collar. Her voice was flat, devoid of the panic Stanton was bleeding all over the net. It wasn't bravery. It was a psychological defense mechanism. If she felt anything right now, she would shatter. Griggs is hit. Through the upper thigh, it clipped the femur. He's bleeding out. Tate's applying the tourniquet, but we're pinned behind the tractor, Stanton yelled. They have the angles. If we move to the breach, we get chewed up. O'Connor, Cameron muttered, not taking her eye off the scope. Find them. Got 'em. O'Connor said, his good eye glued to the spotter. Southern edge of the courtyard. They're huddled behind a burnt-out loader. It's bad cover, boss. The engine block is the only thing stopping rounds. If the hostiles push from the sorting facility ground floor, they have no cover. Cameron did the math. Stanton had led his men into a fatal funnel relying on bad intel and his own arrogance. Now he was paralyzed. The man who had mocked her capacity to carry a rifle was currently hiding behind a tractor tire, watching his point man bleed to death. A dark, venomous spike of contempt flared in her chest. "You arrogant, stupid son of a bitch." She wanted to scream it into the radio. She wanted to ask him if the rifle was too heavy now, but the anger was useless. It was a luxury she couldn't afford. Griggs, a 22-year-old kid who always offered her half his MRE pound cake, was bleeding into the Syrian dirt. Assault 1 Overwatch. Cameron said, her tone sharp, cutting through Stanton's panic like a scalpel. "Stop screaming. Get the TQ high and tight. I have the high ground. Do not move from the engine block. They're going to push us, Hayes. They're massing inside the ground floor." "Let them push," she said coldly. "I own the courtyard." As if on cue, the rusted roll-up doors on the ground floor of the sorting facility rattled open. It wasn't foot soldiers. A battered, sand-colored Toyota Hilux roared out of the shadows, its tires spinning and screeching on the dusty concrete. In the bed of the truck, 2 men were clinging to the roll bar, one of them hefting a PKM machine gun, trying to get his footing as the truck fishtailed toward Stanton's position. "Vehicle technical moving left to right," O'Connor shouted. "Range 550, speed 20 miles an hour." Hitting a moving target at 550 yards was a masterclass in physics. Hitting a moving target while the barrel of your rifle was already superheated, creating a shimmering mirage that warped the image in your scope, was nearly impossible. Cameron didn't feel confident. She felt a sickening wave of doubt. If I miss the engine block, they flank Stanton. The PKM will cut through that tractor tire like paper. She tracked the truck. The mirage off her hot suppressor made the Toyota look like it was underwater, rippling and distorting. "Hold! Hold!" O'Connor whispered, reading the wind, feeling the subtle shift in the air pressure. "Wind is dead. Lead him a full mil." She pulled the crosshairs ahead of the truck's grill. She didn't aim for the men in the back. Taking them out wouldn't stop the truck. She aimed for the driver's side of the windshield. She ripped the trigger. The rifle kicked. Through the scope, she saw the windshield of the Hilux spiderweb and cave inward. The driver slumped over the steering wheel. The dead weight on the gas pedal caused the engine to redline. The truck violently jerked to the left, the tires catching the lip of a concrete drainage ditch. The Hilux violently flipped, a sickening crunch of metal and shattering glass echoing up to the ridge. The 2 men in the back were launched into the air like rag dolls, slamming brutally into the concrete wall of the silos. Neither of them got up. "Target destroyed." O'Connor breathed a note of awe bleeding through his congested, dusty voice. "Good night. 9 down." "Overwatch, what the hell was that?" Stanton yelled. He hadn't even seen the truck coming. He was completely blind, completely broken. "Technical neutralized," Cameron said, racking the bolt. Her hand was cramping the muscles in her forearm, spasming from the death grip she had on the weapon. "Keep pressure on Griggs's leg." She looked down at her rifle. The camouflage tape wrapped around the suppressor was beginning to melt, emitting a foul, toxic smoke that smelled like burning plastic and chemicals. The metal barrel was radiating waves of heat so intense she could feel it baking her face from a foot away. "O'Connor," she rasped, her throat bone dry. "How long?" He checked his wrist. 3 minutes and 40 seconds since the breach. It felt like 3 lifetimes. Her eye was throbbing behind the scope, a sharp, needle-like pain behind her pupil from staring unblinking through the magnified glass. Her breathing was ragged. She wasn't a machine anymore. She was a deeply tired woman, lying in a puddle of dog piss and her own sweat operating a piece of failing machinery. But the courtyard wasn't clear. The math wasn't finished. The dust in the courtyard was thick now, a choking brown fog kicked up by the wrecked truck and the continuous gunfire. It hung in the stagnant air, obscuring the angles, turning the phosphate plant into a hazy, dreamlike hellscape. Movement. O'Connor hissed his voice, dropping to a harsh whisper. Northern alleyway, between the silos and the main plant. 2 dismounts. Cameron swung the rifle. The bipod squeaked a loud, abrasive sound in the tight pipe. She fought the stiffness in her neck, forcing her eye back into the scope. The mirage from her melting suppressor tape was horrendous. The entire bottom half of her sight picture was a blurry, swimming mess. She had to tilt her head slightly, looking through the very top edge of the ocular lens to get a clear view. It was an awkward, unbalanced shooting position that threw off her entire skeletal alignment. Through the haze, she spotted them. 2 men moving fast, hugging the rusted metal wall of the silos. They were smart. They were using the curvature of the structure to mask their approach from the ridge, staying in the blind spots. But they had to cross a 20-foot gap of open concrete to reach the flank of Stanton's tractor, and one of them was carrying a green canvas satchel. Explosives. Cameron said the word, tasting like ash in her mouth. If they get that satchel behind the engine block, Assault 1 is gone. Distance 600 flat, O'Connor said, rapidly wiping his good eye. They're waiting for the dust to shift. Boss, your barrel is cooking. The drift is going to be unpredictable. I know, she snapped. It was the first time she had snapped at him. She regretted it instantly, but there was no time to apologize. She could feel the heat radiating into her left hand, where she gripped the stock. The weapon was begging her to stop. It was designed to be fired cold, to be babied and calculated, not to be run like a machine gun. The internal rifling would be expanding the ballistics, altering with every degree of temperature rise. The 2 men broke cover. They sprinted across the open gap, heading straight for the vulnerable right flank of the pinned SEAL team. Cameron tracked the lead man, the one with the satchel. She didn't have time to calculate the altered ballistics. She had to shoot on pure visceral instinct. The kind of instinct built into the marrow of her bones from years of failure on the training range. She aimed high and right, guessing the heat drift. She pulled the trigger. The rifle roared. The recoil shoved her backward, her elbow scraping raw against the concrete. She looked through the glass. The lead man was still running. Miss! The round had impacted the concrete just behind his heel, kicking up a harmless spout of dust. A cold spike of pure, unadulterated terror pierced Cameron's chest. A miss. She never missed. Not when it mattered. The perfection she wrapped herself in the armor she used to deflect the smirks and the jokes in the briefing room cracked wide open. She was failing. Miss, re-engage! O'Connor yelled, panic, finally breaking his composure. They're closing. Cameron didn't think. Thought was too slow. She acted on a primal, desperate surge of adrenaline. She racked the bolt with such violence she nearly ripped the handle off, slamming the next round into the chamber. She didn't readjust her math. She overcompensated purely by dragging the heavy barrel down and left fighting the exhaustion in her shoulder. The man with the satchel was 5 feet from the tractor. He pulled his arm back to throw. Cameron fired. The heavy bullet caught him in the center of his chest. The kinetic energy was massive. It lifted him off his feet, spinning him backward. The satchel charge flew from his hand, landing harmlessly in the dirt 20 yards away from Stanton. 10 down. The second man, realizing his partner was dead and the charge was lost, panicked. He didn't drop for cover. He turned and bolted back toward the alleyway, a terrified, erratic sprint. Cameron racked the final round in her magazine. Her breathing was entirely unspooled now, coming in ragged, noisy gasps. The sweat in her eyes was blinding her. The rifle was a branding iron against her cheek. She chased the fleeing man with the crosshairs. He was a blurry, swimming shape through the heat waves. "Distance," O'Connor started. "Shut up," she breathed. She trapped the target in the reticle. The man was about to round the corner, about to disappear into the shadows, where he could regroup, where he could hunt her men again. She held her breath, forcing the violent shaking in her arms to stop for exactly 1/4 of a second. Squeeze. The final round left the barrel. The man's head violently snapped forward as he reached the corner. His momentum carried his limp body forward, sliding face first into the dirt alleyway, a cloud of dust blooming around him. 12. Cameron let go of the pistol grip. Her hand fell to the dirt, trembling so violently it looked like she was having a seizure. She didn't rack the bolt. She just lay there, her face pressed against the warm stock of the rifle, her eyes squeezed shut. The echo of the shot rolled down the valley, fading into the immense, indifferent expanse of the Syrian desert. Inside the pipe, the only sound was the harsh, wet rasp of Cameron's breathing and the soft ticking of the Take 338's metal barrel as it desperately tried to cool down. The smell of melted plastic, hot brass, and sweat was thick enough to chew. Down in the courtyard, the radio clicked on. "Overwatch." Tate's voice came through, shaking, stripped of all bravado. We are clear. The push is stopped. Griggs is stable. We are holding." Stanton didn't speak. He didn't get on the net to thank her. He didn't say a word. Cameron slowly opened her eyes. The stinging was intense, her vision blurred by salt and exhaustion. She looked over at O'Connor. The young spotter was staring at her, his face smeared with dirt and tear-streaked limestone mud. The look in his eyes wasn't hero worship. It was the haunted, hollowed-out stare of a man who had just watched a ghost do butcher's work. 5 minutes, O'Connor whispered, his voice cracking. Exactly 5 minutes. Cameron didn't smile. She didn't feel a surge of vindictive triumph. The men in the briefing room would never joke about her again, but she didn't care. Her neck was blistered, her shoulder felt dislocated, and the acidic taste of adrenaline was turning into bile in the back of her throat. She reached up with a shaking hand, keyed her radio, and stared down at the smoking, bloody courtyard. "Copy Assault 1. Cameron said, her voice dropping back into that flat, dead tone. "Hold your perimeter. I'm reloading." Cameron's thumb found the magazine release. She pressed it, and the empty 5-round box dropped free landing in the pulverized limestone with a dull, heavy thud. It was hot to the touch, smoking faintly where the friction of the feeding rounds had kissed the metal lips. She reached down to the nylon pouch strapped to her chest rig. Her fingers were numb, thick and clumsy, like they belonged to someone else. She fumbled with the Velcro flap, the tearing sound shockingly loud in the sudden ringing quiet of the drainage pipe. She extracted a fresh magazine, the cold brass of the .338 Lapua rounds, slick with a thin sheen of factory oil. She seated the magazine into the magwell. Click. She pushed the oversized bolt handle forward, chambering the first round, and locked it down. The rifle was back in battery. She was ready to kill again. But there was nothing left to shoot. "They're falling back," O'Connor breathed. His voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. He was still pressed against the dirt, his spotting scope pushed aside. He was staring down at the courtyard, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow spasms. "The guys in the alley. I saw 2 more pulling the dead guy by his vest. They're running toward the northern wadi, breaking contact." Cameron didn't move her head from the stock. She kept her right eye locked behind the ocular lens, scanning the rusted walkways of the silos, the shattered windows of the sorting facility, the wrecked smoking chassis of the Hilux. The heat rising off her suppressor was completely distorting the bottom half of her vision. The camouflage tape wrapped around the metal can had fused into a bubbling black tar. The stench of burning polymer was trapped inside the concrete pipe, stinging her nostrils, mixing with the sharp ammonia of fired gunpowder and the sour onion-like smell of her own adrenaline-laced sweat. Down in the courtyard, the radio net was a chaotic, ragged mess of heavy breathing and frantic medical shorthand. "I need more pressure on the femoral." Tate was yelling his voice, cracking stripped entirely of the laid-back, dip-chewing persona he wore around the FOB. "He's bleeding through the first TQ, hand me the second one. Now, goddammit." Cameron shifted her rifle, slightly pointing the crosshairs at the group huddled behind the engine block of the burnt-out tractor. Through the magnification, the reality of the violence was stripped of all its abstract math. She could see Griggs lying on his back in the dirt. His multicam pants were soaked a dark, glistening crimson from the groin down to the knee. Tate was kneeling on Griggs's good leg to keep him still, his hands wrapped in blood-slicked latex gloves, violently twisting the windlass of a black tourniquet high up on the wounded man's thigh. Griggs wasn't screaming anymore. That was bad. His head was rolling limply side to side, his helmet pushed back, exposing a face that was the color of old wax. His mouth was open, gasping at the hot air like a fish at the bottom of a boat. And then there was Stanton. Stanton was kneeling a few feet away, his back pressed against the rusted metal of the loader. He wasn't helping Tate. He wasn't pulling security. His rifle was resting in the dirt across his lap. He was just staring at his hands. Cameron watched him through the glass. The man who had sneered at her in the briefing room, the man who had confidently drawn a line on a map and led his men directly into a slaughterhouse, was completely, fundamentally broken. The shock had short-circuited his nervous system. She felt a brief, dark flicker of satisfaction, a cruel, vindictive spark in the back of her brain. Look at him, she thought. Look at the commander. But the feeling died, almost instantly replaced by a hollow, physical exhaustion. The vindication tasted like ash. Proving Stanton wrong didn't feel like a victory. It just felt like sweeping up a mess that never should have been made. "Assault 1 Overwatch," Cameron said. Her throat was so dry the words scraped against her vocal cords like sandpaper. "Status of the casualty." A long pause. She could hear Tate swearing in the background. "Overwatch Tate." The radio clicked. Tate was breathing hard, the audio clipping. "We got the bleeding stopped. 2 TQs, but he's lost a massive amount of volume. He's going into hypovolemic shock. We need a bird right fucking now." "Where is the QRF?" Cameron checked the digital watch strapped to the inside of her left wrist. The numbers were blurry. She had to blink hard, squeezing her eyes shut to clear the stinging salt from her corneas. "QRF and medevac were spun up the second you took contact," Cameron said flatly. "ETA is 12 minutes. You have to keep him awake, Tate." 12 minutes. Jesus Christ." Tate choked. "He doesn't have 12 minutes. The medkit is tapped. I don't have whole blood. He has to have 12 minutes, Cameron replied. "Keep him elevated. Keep him talking." She took her finger off the trigger guard and finally let her cheek leave the stock of the rifle. The sudden loss of tension in her neck muscles caused a sharp, stabbing cramp to shoot down her shoulder blade. She winced, rolling her head to the side. The brass casing that had landed on the back of her neck had left a furious red blister the size of a quarter. The skin was bubbled and raw, weeping clear fluid. The collar of her combat shirt rubbed against it as she moved, sending fresh waves of searing pain up her scalp. She ignored it. She unclipped the hydration bladder tube from her chest. Rig bit down on the rubber valve and sucked a mouthful of water. It was boiling hot from sitting in the sun, tasting strongly of plastic and dust, but it was the best thing she had ever swallowed. She held it in her mouth for a second, letting it soak into her parched tongue before swallowing. She looked over at O'Connor. He was sitting up now, leaning his back against the curved concrete wall of the pipe. His helmet was off. His face was a mask of grey limestone dust, tracked with two clean rivers of tears where his eyes had watered from the debris. He was staring at her. He didn't look at her like she was a hero. He looked at her like she was an alien. He had watched her execute 12 men in under 5 minutes with the cold mechanical precision of an industrial stamping press. He had seen her take a burning piece of brass to the neck and not even flinch. "You good kid?" Cameron asked. Her voice was low, devoid of any maternal warmth. It was just a tactical check. O'Connor swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. He looked down at his hands, which were trembling violently. Yeah, boss, I'm good. The dust it got in my eye." "Keep your head on a swivel," Cameron said, turning back to the scope. "They broke contact, but they might just be maneuvering to mortar range. We aren't done until the birds are on the deck." "Copy," O'Connor whispered. He picked up his spotting scope, wiping the objective lens with the corner of his filthy sleeve, and went back to work. Cameron settled back behind the rifle. The pain in her neck throbbed in time with her heartbeat. The barrel of the TAC 338 was still radiating waves of heat, but the mirage was beginning to settle. The flies returned, buzzing aggressively around the fresh blood on her cheek where the spalling rock had cut her. She let them crawl on her skin. She didn't blink. She just watched the courtyard, waiting for the sky to tear open. The sound hit them before the visual. A low, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack that vibrated through the limestone ridge. It wasn't the rattling hum of the Chinook that had dropped them off. It was the aggressive chopping beat of two MH-60 Black Hawks flying nap of the earth, pushing their airspeeds to the absolute limit. Inbounds. O'Connor called out his voice, finally finding a steady octave. "Coming up the wadi from the south, 2 minutes out." Assault 1 Overwatch. Cameron keyed her mic. "Birds are on approach. Mark the HLZ." Down in the courtyard, Tate dug a smoke grenade out of his chest rig. He pulled the pin and tossed it into the center of the concrete expanse, halfway between the wrecked tractor and the smoking remains of the Toyota Hilux. A thick plume of violet smoke hissed out, billowing upward, catching the dry desert breeze and drifting lazily toward the silos. The Black Hawks crested the ridge, dropping into the valley like predatory birds. The lead chopper flared aggressively, its tail dropping as the pilot bled off speed, hovering directly over the violet smoke. The rotor wash hit the courtyard like a hurricane. Through the scope, Cameron watched the dust and debris instantly weaponize. Loose concrete, empty brass casings, and pieces of the shattered truck were whipped into a blinding horizontal sandstorm. Tate threw his body over Griggs, shielding the wounded man's face with his own chest. Stanton finally moved. The sheer violence of the helicopter's arrival seemed to snap him out of his catatonia. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing his rifle, leaning heavily against the wind. The Black Hawk's wheels touched the concrete. The side doors were already open. 2 medics in flight gear leapt out, carrying a rigid litter sprinting toward the tractor. "Assault 1 is loading," O'Connor reported. Cameron didn't reply. She watched the medics drop to their knees beside Griggs. They didn't bother checking the tourniquets. They trusted Tate's work. They immediately rolled the pale, unconscious SEAL onto the litter, strapped him down, and lifted him in one fluid, practiced motion. Tate grabbed Griggs's rifle and helmet, following the medics toward the chopper. Stanton was already at the door, pulling himself into the cabin, turning his back on the courtyard. "They have him." Cameron said, her finger finally slipping off the trigger guard entirely. She reached forward and flipped the safety lever on the TAC 338 to safe. The metallic click was the loudest sound in the world. "Break it down, O'Connor. We're leaving." Getting out of the hide was an agony of stiff joints and bruised muscles. Cameron's lower back screamed in protest as she contorted her body to slide out of the narrow concrete pipe. The air outside was marginally cooler, but the sun was high now, bleaching the desert into a blinding, featureless white. She collapsed the bipod on the rifle, secured the scope covers, and strapped the heavy weapon to the side of her pack. Hoisting the 60-pound rucksack onto her shoulders felt like strapping an anvil to a fresh sunburn. The straps dug directly into the weeping blister on her neck. She let out a sharp, involuntary hiss of pain through her teeth. "You need me to carry the gun, boss?" O'Connor asked. He was watching her wince, his face tight with concern. It was a genuine offer, stripped of the mockery Stanton had used in the briefing room. Cameron paused. She looked at O'Connor. He was a good kid. He was terrified, he was inexperienced, but he wasn't cruel. "No," Cameron said softly, adjusting the shoulder strap to shift the weight an inch to the left. "I carry my own weight. Let's move." The hike down to the courtyard took 20 minutes. It was a treacherous descent over loose shale and steep drop-offs. By the time they reached the ground floor of the phosphate plant, the second Black Hawk, the extraction bird, was sitting on the concrete, its rotors idling, waiting for them. As they walked across the courtyard, the reality of what Cameron had done via a magnified scope was laid bare in high-definition, unsanitized reality. The smell hit her first. It was a thick, metallic stench of fresh blood mixed with the sickening, sweet odor of ruptured bowels. The man she had shot with the satchel charge was lying 10 yards from the tractor. The .338 round had hit him in the center of the chest, but the exit wound had taken out a section of his spine and lower intestines. He was spread-eagled in a pool of dark, congealing fluid, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the harsh Syrian sun. Flies were already gathering by the hundreds, forming a black, buzzing carpet over his wounds. Cameron walked past him without breaking stride. She didn't look down. She didn't feel remorse, and she didn't feel triumph. She felt entirely numb, wrapped in a cold, professional detachment that allowed her to function in a world made of meat and bone. They reached the door of the Black Hawk. The crew chief reached down, grabbing Cameron by the plate carrier, hauling her up into the vibrating cabin. O'Connor scrambled in behind her. As she sat down on the canvas troop seat, she looked across the cabin. Stanton's squad was sitting opposite her. They were covered in Griggs' blood. Tate was staring at the floor, his hands coated in rust-colored dried flakes, his jaw trembling slightly. And then she saw Stanton. He was sitting in the corner, strapped into his seat. His face was devoid of color. When Cameron sat down, he slowly lifted his head. Their eyes met over the roar of the helicopter engines. Cameron waited for the anger to rise in her. She waited for the urge to scream at him, to demand an apology, to ask him how heavy he thought her rifle was now. She had the moral high ground. She had saved his life, and she had saved his men all, while he cowered behind a tractor tire. But as she looked at him, she realized she had nothing to say. Stanton's eyes were completely empty. The arrogant, swaggering officer from the briefing room was dead killed by 5 minutes of uncontrolled violence. He looked pathetic. He looked small. He looked away, first dropping his gaze back to his boots, unable to hold eye contact with the woman he had dismissed as a PR stunt. The helicopter banked sharply, climbing into the sky, leaving the ruined courtyard and the 12 bodies behind. Cameron leaned her head back against the vibrating bulkhead of the aircraft. She didn't smile. She closed her eyes, listening to the deafening roar of the rotors, and wished more than anything that she could take a shower. The FOB was exactly as they had left it, an ugly sprawl of HESCO barriers, GP medium tents, and humming diesel generators sitting in a bowl of brown dust. But the atmosphere had shifted. Word had outpaced the helicopters. When the Black Hawk touched down on the metal matting of the landing pad, the flight line was quiet. There was no joking. There were no casual waves. The ground crew hooked the bird with grim, tight expressions. The medevac chopper had landed 10 minutes prior. Griggs was already in the surgical tent fighting for his life, getting whole blood pumped into his collapsing veins. Cameron stepped off the ramp. The heat of the base washed over her thick and stagnant. She shrugged her rucksack higher onto her bruised shoulders and started walking toward the armory. O'Connor fell in step half a pace behind her, a silent shadow. Stanton and his men went the other way, heading straight for the medical tent to wait for news on Griggs. No one spoke. No one said, "Thank you." The silence between the two elements was profound, a chasm carved out of guilt trauma, and a shift in the hierarchy so violent it left them all mute. The armory was an air-conditioned shipping container that smelled strongly of CLP cleaner, lubricant preservative and damp canvas. The armorer, a burly master chief with a greying beard, stood behind the wire mesh window. He normally had a sarcastic comment for everyone who walked up to his cage. Today, he just looked at Cameron. He looked at the blood smeared across her cheek, the dirt caked into the wrinkles of her uniform, and the heavy TIC 338 rifle slung across her chest. "Oh, Commander," he said, his voice entirely devoid of its usual gravelly humour. It was a tone of absolute deferential respect. "Chief," Cameron replied. Her voice was raspy, barely a whisper. She unslung the rifle and laid it gently on the wooden counter. It was covered in a thick layer of pale limestone dust. The suppressor at the end of the barrel was a horrific mess of melted black polymer tape, fused directly to the metal. The chief looked down at the weapon. He noted the melted suppressor. He noted the empty magazines she pulled from her chest rig. 12 rounds expended. Cameron said, unstrapping the sniper logbook from her wrist and sliding it under the mesh. "I need a new can. This one is cooked. Baffles are likely warped from the heat. I'll get it rebarreled and get a new suppressor fitted by 0400 Boss," the chief said quietly. He didn't ask how she had melted a high-temperature suppressor in 5 minutes. He didn't ask how 12 rounds correlated to the frantic radio chatter he had been listening to. He just gently pulled the rifle into the cage. "Go get clean." Cameron walked to the women's shower trailer. It was a luxury she rarely used, often opting to just use baby wipes in her tent to avoid the long walk across the compound. But today she felt like she was coated in something heavy and toxic. The trailer was empty. She locked the metal door behind her, the deadbolt sliding home with a reassuring clack. She stood in front of the scratched plastic mirror bolted above the aluminum sinks. She looked at herself. She looked exactly the same, and entirely different. Her eyes were sunken, rimmed with dark, bruised circles of exhaustion. The spall cut on her cheek had clotted into a jagged black scab. Her hair matted with sweat, and dirt clung to her skull. She unzipped her combat shirt and peeled it off. The fabric clung to the weeping blister on the back of her neck, tearing a layer of skin away as she pulled it over her head. She gasped, her hands gripping the edges of the sink, as a fresh wave of stinging pain washed over her. She turned to look at her shoulder in the mirror. The recoil pad of the Magnum rifle had bruised her violently. Her right anterior deltoid was a canvas of deep purple and mottled yellow, swollen and angry. She stepped into the fiberglass shower stall and turned the water on. It came out tepid, smelling faintly of chlorine. As the water hit her, the dirt began to wash away. The water pooling around the drain turned a milky grey, then shifted to a pale, rusty pink as the dried blood from her cheek and the grime from the courtyard washed off her skin. She stood there for a long time, her head pressed against the cool fiberglass wall, letting the water run over her aching muscles. She had done it. She had survived the crucible. She had silenced the critics, saved the team, and proved unequivocally that she was one of the most lethal assets in the theatre. But as she watched the pink water swirl down the drain, she realized the terrible truth about what she did for a living. There was no climax. There was no swelling orchestral music. There was no deep, satisfying closure. Stanton was still a broken man, Griggs might still die on an operating table, and 12 men with mothers and histories and reasons for holding those rifles were rotting in the Syrian sun. She had won the respect she thought she desperately wanted, and she found that it felt like absolutely nothing. It was just an empty, hollow void in the center of her chest. She was just a mechanic, and the rifle was her wrench. She fixed violent problems with violent solutions, and tomorrow someone would ask her to do it again. Cameron turned off the water. She stepped out of the stall, wrapping a thin, scratchy towel around her waist. She dried her hair, ignoring the stinging on her neck, and put on a clean t-shirt. When she walked out of the shower trailer, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the FOB. O'Connor was sitting on a plastic crate near the door. He had showered his face, scrubbed clean, his hair wet. He was holding 2 styrofoam cups of coffee. He stood up when he saw her. He didn't smile. He just held out one of the cups. "Chief said the rifle will be ready by 04, O'Connor said quietly. Cameron looked at the cup. She looked at the young man who had watched her dismantle her own humanity to keep him alive. She took the coffee. It was lukewarm and smelled like burnt plastic. "Good," Cameron said, taking a sip, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. "We 0 at 05. Get some sleep." She walked past him, heading toward her tent in the fading light, carrying the weight of the silence with her. When the smoke clears, it's never about the medals or the ego. It's about who holds the line when the laughing stops and the dying begins. Cameron didn't just break the glass ceiling. She shattered it with 12 rounds of .338 Lapua. But the real cost of survival is the silence that follows. If this raw, unfiltered look at tactical combat and the heavy price of duty got your blood-pumping smash, that like button, share this story with your squad, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next deep dive into the realities of war.